Okay, so let's unpack this. We're diving into a really incredible chapter from E.O. Wilson called The Superorganism.
Hmm.
And it's from his book Biophilia, which, at its core, argues for this innate, deep connection humanity has with the natural world.
And this chapter is maybe the most powerful case he makes for that. He does something brilliant. He takes us on this journey that juxtaposes two extremes.
Right.
On one hand, you have this huge macro-level destruction in the Amazon driven by human economics.
Literally clear-cutting the forest.
Exactly. And then he zooms all the way in to the microscopic perfection of this one biological machine, the leafcutter ant colony.
And that's our mission for this deep dive. We want to trace that journey with him from the big crisis down to the tiny, intricate details and see how he connects it all back to, ethics, culture, and our place in the world.
It's about why biodiversity isn't just nice to have. It's profound. It holds secrets.
Absolutely. So let's follow his footsteps from that global crisis right down to the life of the anthill. So we start big. We're in Manaus, Brazil. It's March 1983.
Yeah, Wilson is back in the Amazon to study tropical ants, but his first stop is a World Wildlife Fund field site, maybe 60 miles north of the city.
And this is not some fancy university lab. He describes it as, well, pretty rugged, just a camp full of biologists who are trying to do something huge.
They were. This was the home of the Minimum Critical Size Project. It was pioneered by Thomas Lovejoy back in the late 70s.
And the question they're trying to answer is just massive.
It's one of the most critical questions in all of conservation science. How large? I mean, how physically big does a wildlife preserve have to be to actually work?
To permanently sustain the species inside it.
Right, because if it's too small, it's just a temporary zoo. It's an urgent puzzle, and they were, literally on the front lines trying to solve it.
And there's a simple ecological rule that's driving all this urgency. It's the idea that when a species loses its range, it's territory.
The risk of extinction just skyrockets. And it's not linear, it's exponential.
He gives the example of grizzly bears, which I think makes it really clear.
It does. I mean, think about it. You have 10 bears on 100 square miles.
Okay.
And then you have 1,000 bears on 10,000 square miles. That first group, the small one, is incredibly vulnerable.
One bad winter, a disease.
Anything. A flood. Their numbers could just zigzag down to zero very quickly. The larger population has genetic diversity, it has resilience, it can absorb shocks.
And that leads directly to this concept he calls the island in an agricultural sea.
Yes. This is so important. When you clear-cut the forest all around a nature reserve, that patch of forest instantly becomes an ecological island.
Just like Puerto Rico or Bali, it's isolated.
Totally isolated. And for so many species, that's a death sentence. Maybe not immediately, but over the long term.
Because they can't migrate, they can't find new mates.
Exactly. So the diversity inside that island will inevitably fall. It'll drop to a new, lower, and sadly predictable level.
Which puts conservationists in this terrible bind.
It's a horrible compromise. The reserves have to be small enough for governments to say yes, for economic reasons.
But they have to be big enough to actually save the animals and plants inside them.
And nobody knew exactly where that line was. And that technical problem, that challenge, is just thrown into sharp relief by what Wilson actually sees on the ground around Manaus.
The physical destruction.
It's so vivid. He says the rainforest is being clear-cut from the edge inward and lifted up like a carpet rolled off a bare floor.
And that cleared land is so fragile. People think, oh, you clear the jungle, you get rich farmland.
That's not what happens.
No. And the reason is crucial to understand the Amazon. All the good stuff, the organic matter, the nutrients, it's not in the soil.
It's in the trees themselves.
Yes. The actual topsoil is just a few inches deep. So when you cut and burn the trees, the first big equatorial downpour just washes it all away.
And what's left behind is what he calls a freshly deserted battlefield. Just blackened stumps and hard, exposed soil. You see these huge termite mounds everywhere because the termites are feasting on all the dead wood.
And that exposed soil, he calls it lateritic clay.
Right. It's full of iron and aluminum, but it's been stripped of everything organic. So when the sun and rain hit it, it literally bakes. It turns hard as a rock.
So the magnificent forest is gone, replaced by, in his words, a forlorn scattering of bony white cattle.
And this is where he delivers that incredible analogy.
It's a Renaissance painting.
Yeah. He says that defending this kind of destruction on economic grounds is like burning a Renaissance painting to cook dinner.
The tiny temporary gain you get is just nothing compared to the permanent loss of an absolute masterpiece of evolution.
It's such a powerful way to frame it. And he does note that, Brazilian policy was starting to shift thanks to influence from biologists.
So they were moving away from just settling the landless to actually trying to preserve some of it.
In principle, at least, leaving half the forest standing. And experts like John Terborgh had done the math.
And the numbers are huge.
Huge. To keep species loss under 1% over the next century, you need more than 20 reserves, and each one needs to be, at a minimum, 1,000 square miles.
Which brings us right back to the Manus experiment, because that's what they were testing.
Precisely. They marked off 20 plots of land from tiny 1-hectare squares up to 1,000 hectares.
And they just left them as islands in this new agricultural sea.
Surveying everything they could, trees, butterflies, monkeys, to see what survived. They were trying to find that minimum number, that magic area, before the whole forest was gone.
Okay, so that's the macro crisis. But then he shifts. The whole tone of the chapter changes.
It becomes incredibly personal. He gets in a truck and rides deep into the forest to a place called Fazenda Esteo.
And the camp is super minimal. A cook's shed, some hammocks.
But for him, it's paradise. He talks about the sheer delight of just being able to roll out of his hammock, walk 20 paces, and be in virgin rainforest.
He even quotes Charles Darwin from 1832, that cathedral feeling.
That sense of wonder, astonishment, and sublime devotion, it's a spiritual experience for him.
And this is where we really see his process as an observer.
Oh, yeah. He talks about just holding perfectly still.
And just looking. Staring at a few centimeters of tree trunk or the ground.
And realizing that every time you shift your focus, even a tiny bit, a new organism just appears, something you didn't see before.
He says the silence isn't empty.
No, the silence is evidence of the intensity of the enveloping life. It's full.
And then there's the sound, the one sound that defines the forest.
The falling tree. He says it's a sharp crack, like a rifle shot.
Followed by a whoosh.
And then a solid, earth-shaking thump. And it happens randomly. An old, rotten tree, heavy with vines, just gives way.
He points out that it's a real danger. The longer you spend in the forest, the more that cumulative risk builds up.
That sound, that final crash, it's a perfect transition because it brings us down to the forest floor.
Right to the star of the show.
The leafcutter ant. Atacephalotes.
Locally called Sava. And he says they are rivaled only by us, by humans, as the prime consumer of fresh vegetation in the tropics.
So his first day there, at dusk, he sees them, these little brick-red, spiny worker ants about 1/4 inch long.
Just pouring out of the forest.
Pouring is the right word. He says they formed twin rivers of tens of thousands, marching 10 or more abreast.
Following a pass from a giant earthen nest 100 yards away, all the way to a tree with white flowers.
And here's where it gets really interesting. You have to scale it up to appreciate what they're doing.
Right, so if you imagine that 1/4 inch ant is the size of a 6-foot person.
That ant is running a 10-mile trail. A marathon.
It's 16 miles per hour.
Which is faster than the human world record.
And it's not just running, it's carrying the equivalent of a 750-pound load on the way back.
At 15 miles per hour, and they just do this endlessly, 24 hours a day.
It's unbelievable. How do they even do that?
It's chemistry, pure chemical communication. They lay down a trail from a secretion from their sting, like ink from a pen.
And he even names the molecule.
He does. Methyl-4-methylpyrrole 2 carboxylate. He names it to show how specific and powerful this world is.
The power is incredible. He says 1 milligram.
It's just a tiny speck.
Could theoretically lead a column of ants 3 times around the entire world.
So the amazing thing isn't the chemical itself. It's the ants' senses, their unique sensitivity.
That's the difference between us and them. We are audiovisual creatures.
Exactly. We live by sight and sound. Social insects are primarily chemical. They live in a world of smell and taste.
So they're not even following a liquid line on the ground.
No, it's a cloud. A long, thin cloud of molecules diffusing just above the soil. And they use their antennae, which are covered in thousands of sensors, sweeping them back and forth to stay inside that cloud.
The precision is just staggering.
It's incredible. If an ant's left antenna goes outside the odor cloud, in thousandths of a second, it perceives the change and pulls back to the right.
Wow.
And they use those antennae to touch other ants, too. If another ant doesn't have the exact, correct chemical signature of their colony,
the colony's unique scent.
They might attack it on the spot and spray an alarm chemical to call for backup.
And that precision, that chemical world, is the foundation for their entire economy. It's like a biological assembly line.
A perfect one. And the division of labor is all based on one thing:
So
size.
you have the big foragers. They're the ones we see outside, cutting the leaves and petals and carrying them home like little parasols.
Right. And once they get those leaves deep underground, the assembly line kicks in.
They just drop them in a chamber.
And slightly smaller workers take over. They clip the leaves into tiny millimeter-sized fragments.
Then what happens?
Still smaller ants crush those fragments, mold them, and add them to the fungal garden.
The fungal garden.
Yeah, these masses that look like gray cleaning sponges. And this fungus, which grows like a white frost over the paste, that's the only thing the ants eat. It's a symbiosis. The fungus digests the cellulose for them.
But the work gets even smaller, even more specialized.
Oh, yeah. The tiniest workers, he says they're smaller than the printed letter I. They are the gardeners. They patrol the fungal beds, constantly weeding out any alien molds or spores.
And the specialization is absolute, right?
It has to be. The big foragers are way too big and clumsy to do that delicate work.
And the tiny gardeners are way too weak to go out and cut leaves.
And this extends to defense, too. You have the soldier ants,
Heavyweights.
300 times heavier than the little gardeners. Their heads are a 1/4 inch wide, just packed with muscle.
And their jaws.
He says they're like miniature wire clippers. They can slice through another insect or human skin. Wilson says he had to stop his own work sometimes just to staunch the bleeding from a single bite.
And no other animal ever figured this out, turning fresh leaves into mushrooms.
Nope. This evolutionary trick, millions of years ago, gave them this incredible advantage. It's why they dominate the American tropics.
They consume more vegetation than any other group.
By far. And it's why they cause over $1 billion in damage a year to human agriculture. The early Portuguese settlers weren't wrong when they called Brazil the kingdom of the ants.
And at the very center of all of this, deep underground, is the queen.
The queen. He describes her as a giant insect the size of a newborn mouse. And she can live for 10, maybe 20 years.
And her only job is to lay eggs.
Constantly. Her reproductive output is just staggering. Over 20 million offspring in her lifetime.
So just think about that. A mere 300 ants from one colony can produce more new ants in a year than there are human beings on Earth.
It's a biological explosion. And what's fascinating is the genetic part. The workers and the queen, they have the same genes.
So the difference is just what they were fed as larvae.
That's it. It's all about how they're raised.
So her life cycle climaxes with the nuptial flight.
After a reign, all the virgin queens fly up. They're inseminated by a few males who die right after, and then she lands.
That breaks off her own wings.
Painlessly. He says they're just dead tissue at that point. She digs a tunnel and starts her new colony.
But she has to do one critical thing first.
The most important step. She carries a tiny piece of the vital symbiotic fungus with her in a little pocket in the floor of her mouth. She plants that wad of fungus in her new room, and she fertilizes it with her own feces.
And she feeds her first brood of workers with her own eggs.
Right. And once those first little workers emerge, she stops doing everything else. For the rest of her life, her only job is to eat and lay eggs.
Wilson says that when people ask him if he sees, human qualities in the ants.
He always says no. He sees an organic machine.
Like the back of a Swiss watch?
Exactly. Clean, thrumming precision. He doesn't anthropomorphize them.
Okay, but then he immediately calls the colony a superorganism. So if it's a machine, how could it be a superorganism? Where's the brain? Where's the master plan?
And that is the key. In a superorganism, the queen isn't a leader. She's not a monarch giving orders.
She's the reproductive system.
Exactly. The master plan isn't in one brain. It's partitioned. It's distributed across the tiny brains of millions of all-female workers. The entire society is the brain.
So the whole colony is one organism.
That's how he sees it. He says from above, the foraging columns look like a giant amoeba with pseudopods reaching out to engulf plants.
That ant-fungus partnership. He calls it one of evolution's master clockworks.
Tireless, repetitive, precise, and more complicated than anything humans have ever invented. They own each other and will never pull apart.
So when you pull back and look at this whole journey he's taken us on,
you're left with these two huge contrasting insights. First, you have the urgent technical problem of conservation, the Manos Project. We need to figure out the minimum space life needs to survive.
the macro view.
And second, you have the breathtaking, almost alien sophistication of what's inside that space, the superorganism.
A micro view.
And that reminds us that the real scientific frontier isn't somewhere out in space. It's right here, in the bodies and lives of the species on the other side of that tragic line of deforestation.
So what does this all mean for you listening to this? I think this chapter really forces you to confront a hard truth.
Hmm.
We are systematically destroying life forms, like this ant superorganism, that represent a kind of evolutionary perfection that is, well, it's far beyond anything we can currently build or even fully comprehend.
And that leads to a final thought. Consider that level of organization Wilson described. Millions of individuals coordinating perfectly without a leader for millions of years. If that collective is the brain, what does the sheer antiquity and stability and, the functional perfection of that system suggest about nature's ethical priority over our own temporary, often destructive economic gains?
Something to mull over. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us. We'll talk soon.